Here in the Diocese of Raleigh, today is Centennial Sunday. About a week and a half ago, some of us were able to go to the cathedral to celebrate with the bishop and also a few cardinals from here in the United States, several bishops from the region, and the great majority of the priests from the diocese to celebrate 100 years since the founding of the Diocese of Raleigh. And one thing that Bishop Luis has asked all of us is that, even though not everybody was able to go to the cathedral for that celebration, that we all celebrate in our local communities today on this Sunday. And so I think it's good to take a moment and reflect on the history, and this will tie into the gospel as well. 1789, so very soon after the founding of the country, John Carroll was appointed the first Catholic bishop in the United States. And he headed up the Diocese of Baltimore. So kind of all of the Catholics in the United States, who weren't very many, would depend on Bishop Carroll. Then if you fast forward almost 100 years, in 1868, the state of North Carolina was designated a vicariate apostolic with Bishop James Gibbons installed in Wilmington as its administrator. So some of you may be familiar with Gibbons High School in Raleigh. And, so that's named after this kind of first prelate, at least, of the area. Later, he goes on to Baltimore and continues his ministry in the church there. And then the Diocese of Raleigh, as such, is established December 12, 1924, by Pope Pius XI. And we, today are still witnesses and heirs of so many that have come before. Something that's been interesting over the course of the last few months that I've been here and getting to know many of the local priests, it's been really interesting talking to the older priests who have more experience in the diocese, because what they all very much share is that when they arrived, some of them 30, 40, some even with 50 years of experience of ministry, they said, North Carolina is really mission territory. And over the last perhaps 30, 20 years, there's been a lot of influx from other areas of the country. And so the Catholic community has grown as well. And many of us were witness to this yesterday. Many of the students went and participated in a Catholympics. So the kind of a field day put on, hosted a little bit by NC State and the Knights of Columbus, but then there were 3 Catholic campus ministries that got together from NC State, UNC, and Duke. So we put aside our rivalries, at least for a few hours, and we're able to celebrate together. And I think it was a beautiful show of what it means to be Catholic. And personally, I was very impressed by how many participated. Apparently, we didn't get the memo because NC State showed up in red, UNC showed up in that particularly problematic hue of blue, but then the Duke students were a little humbler yesterday, so we showed up kind of a little more varied. But it was a great show of unity, and I think a great way to see how the church is growing. And I think that relates to today's gospel, because today's gospel, we're talking about the end times. And so we're called to reflect on what's going on in the world. In the gospel, Jesus says, that you look at the fig tree and you're able to kind of to read from that and to see what's going on. And as Christians, as Catholics, we're called to look at the world and see what's going on, so that we can adjust, so that we can modify, so that we can make sure that we're preaching the gospel of Christ in a way that's effective in the modern world. Somebody who was a great example of that for me was always Pope John Paul II. Somebody who sought to carry out the work of Christ, making his pontificate very much Christ-centered from the publication of his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, on the Redemptor of man. So from the very beginning of his pontificate in 1978 until the end in 2005, I think you could say one of the constants in John Paul II's preaching was preaching precisely the person of Christ. Christ entered the world to be a witness to the truth, and St. John Paul II did the same through standing up consistently for universal human dignity in the face of totalitarian communist regimes of the East, and then also heartless applications of capitalism in the West. He was somebody who learned to read the signs of the times. That's something we're called to do as well, and to look at our world. And there's good signs, and like the growth of a diocese and expansion of the church, and even that people from UNC and Duke can get along for a few hours. These wonderful signs of Christian charity. But then we have to also be aware of negative things that might go on in our world. And this is called reading the signs of the times. And this comes out in the Second Vatican Council in Gaudium et Spes. To carry out such a task, the Church has always had the duty of scrutinizing the signs of the times and of interpreting them in the light of the gospel. Thus, in language intelligible to each generation, she can respond to the perennial questions which men ask about this present life and the life to come, and about the relationship of the one to the other. We must therefore recognize and understand the world in which we live, its explanations, its longings, and its often dramatic characteristics. And so we're called to recognize, to realize what's going on in our world. And if we look at the news, I think so much is trying to divide us. But I think, even like an event like yesterday, or seeing the diocese coming together, we're able to see how the message of Christ is able to bring us together, to unite us. But we're not supposed to be naive. We're supposed to be aware. One phrase that I really like from Jesus is when he says that we're called to be gentle as doves, but prudent as serpents. So he's not saying to just, give in to the powers of evil. There's a passage from C.S. Lewis in his seminal work of Christian apologetics, Mere Christianity. Enemy-occupied territory. That's what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed. You might say landed in disguise, and is calling us all to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. I think without moving perhaps too much into militaristic terms or militaristic images, we have to be aware that we're in a world that's very much hostile to the values of the gospel. And so if we're going to be true, if we're going to be faithful to the gospel, if we're going to be faithful to who we are called to be as Christians and Catholics, we have to be aware that oftentimes the world is not going to help us. If we realize that as Christians we are living in enemy-occupied territory, we will no longer be surprised when we experience that the world hates us. As we hear Christ say in John 15, Jesus promised as much to his followers. And so I think we can be aware of this and reading the signs of the times, and on the one hand being aware and joyful with so much good news that's happening, but also be aware that we have a mission and that we're called to give witness in a world that's often so hostile to what Christ is calling us to be. So my question for each one of you is, what are you contributing? What are you doing in order to promote the gospel, in order to promote the values of the gospel in a world that's promoting everything else except Jesus? We need men and women in all the fields of science and culture who comprehend the church's message and are willing to translate it into the language of their peers. That's one of the things that gives me so much hope working with so many of you, is seeing how you're taking your formation, you're taking your future very seriously. And something that's always fascinating for me is when a young man, when a young woman comes and is able to discuss topics of the faith, and looking especially, how do I live this out when I'm studying bioengineering? Or how do I live this out when my professor or other companions in class say something very much opposed to the gospels that my family gave me, that the church preaches? I think that's something that's important. Pope John Paul II, another example in this way as well. He has his letter to artists, which I think is a great way that he was trying to dialogue with current culture, and also so many of his interventions to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, trying to engage with the modern world and trying to bring out those perennial gospel values in a world that oftentimes can be so challenging. Much work remains to be done. So regardless of what you're studying, look at there where I am, I am in the world. What can I do? What threats to the gospel touch most closely the home? And how can I respond in a way that I am able to give faithful witness to Christ, but also, contribute really to my own field of knowledge, medicine, engineering, literature, art, whatever we're doing, there's room for Christ. Whatever we're doing, there's room to preach the gospel. First of all, through our own witness. I remember when I was in high school, my senior year, I worked at a pizza place, and it's probably been one of the most aggressive atmospheres where I've ever been, morally speaking. My companions didn't seem like their first value or their highest value was living out the gospel. And so they would say a lot of things, and most of the time I would just kind of let them talk. But then I remember, about 6 months into working there, one of my companions came up and he's like, "So you really believe?" And he said, some hard teaching of the church. And I said, "Yes, I really believe that." And he just kind of, went back to his own things. But for me, it's always been an example of how we're able to give witness. And when we're faithful in the little things that we're doing, people notice. And then perhaps it's in a moment of difficulty, a moment of questioning, that they come to us and ask, and we're able to shed the light of Christ on whatever problem it is that they're facing. So today, as we're winding down the liturgical year, getting closer to the Feast of Christ the King, which will be next Sunday, and as we read kind of these more apocalyptic passages from Scripture, that we can be aware that we truly are building up the kingdom of Christ. First of all, by being present here at Mass, by participating in the Mass, but also in our studies, in our work throughout the week, that there too we may always preach the message of Christ.